Tôi Maayong buntag, Negros Oriental. Good morning, Philippines. I am Hans Villarhermosa, and welcome to the third episode of FlexiEd, Flexible Learning Experience in Education. Brought to us by the Department of Education Division of Negros Oriental, FlexiEd is a modular learning modality that is fair and equal to all. Whoever you are, wherever you are, and whatever you have, the quest for basic quality education continues. Now, last episode, we had a very meaningful and informative tour around the world on the best practices as to how schools around the world are bringing the classroom to the students. Now, karon na episode, mga viewers, we will have a very inspiring talk as well. This time, we'll be moving to the African continent and to hear an inspiring talk from someone very inspiring as well. And he will be talking about inclusive education. So exciting, diba? So now, of course, I know everyone is excited for this talk. So allow me to introduce to everyone our speaker for today's episode. So our speaker is a native of Calatrava, Negros Occidental. He graduated with a bachelor's degree of secondary education, major in English, magna cum laude in Silliman University in 2008. In the same year, he was awarded as one of the 10 outstanding students of the Philippines. Now, currently, he works as an inclusive education officer at the United Nations Children's Fund, or UNICEF, government of Kenya, in establishing an education system inclusive to all children, including those with disabilities. And so, ladies and gentlemen, all the way from Nairobi, Kenya, let us welcome Mr. Rolando Jr. All right, hello, Kuya June.
Hi Hans, maayong adlaw, maayong buntag, kumusta?
Good morning. We're doing fine here, Kuya. Ikaw, how are you there in Kenya?
Very good Hans, nangapi ko kay sayong buntag pa dinhi, mga pita.
Well, it's almost lunchtime dire, Kuya. Pero mangutan na lang mi, Kuya, there in Kenya, can you paint us a picture as to how the new normal is there karon sa Nairobi, Kenya, where you at right now?
The first case of coronavirus sa Kenya was identified March 2020, this year. And when that first case was identified, Hans, schools across the country were closed. And until now, schools are still closed and magpadayon siyang closed until January 2021, that's next year. So Nairobi, for example, where I'm based, that's the capital city of Kenya, lockdown siya for 2 to 3 months. It was only yesterday when the president declared to reopen Nairobi to other counties or provinces para po ma-open up ang economy.
Wow. So grabe, this entire pandemic really has affected everyone around the world, and especially karon no, sa aspects of education, a lot of people are struggling, right? And so karon, that's true. So karon now, FlexiEd is about to give you a very informative talk to mga viewers, and Kuya June is ready to give his talk as well. Kuya June, you will have 20 minutes to share to everyone here. This is not just for Negros Oriental, but this is for the entire country here in the Philippines. And you'll be talking about inclusive education. So Kuya June, are you ready?
I'm ready, Hans. Salamat.
All right, so take it away.
So, salamat Hans sa introduction, and then I'm so happy to be here. Kay interesado ko nga mo engage sa atong mga audience karong adlaw kung unsa gining gitawag natong inclusive education. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard of this terminology for years, and there has been a growing emphasis on inclusive education as a critical component to promote education for all. So ang atong buhaton karon is ato lang i-explore further unsa ning gitawag natong inclusive education. So magsugod ta sa pag-identify unsa ning inclusive education, so the what of inclusive education, and then the why. Nganong kinahanglan man gyud ang inclusive education? Unsa may justifications for inclusive education? And then finally, atong tukion kung unsaon pag-implement ang inclusive education from a systems level as well as schools and classrooms level, recognizing the COVID-19 pandemic as well. So the what, the why, and how of inclusive education. Let's start with the what of inclusive education. And akong i-invite ang atong mga viewers and also our audience to have a look at the situation or scenario on screen. And this is about a teacher called Aliana, and I'll read to you the scenario. Aliana teaches English online, and one of her lessons aims to develop students' reading comprehension. Aliana recognizes the fact that some of her students struggle comprehending long texts. So, what she does is that she develops graphics or visual formats for certain texts, encouraging all her students to understand text through pictures and flowcharts. So, sa atong mga viewers karon, I'll give you a few seconds to read again the scenario and then reflect a little bit about the experience of Aliana. What is your impression sa practice ni Aliana as a teacher in delivering lessons online? How is Aliana responding to the diverse needs of her students or learners? Is Aliana inclusive enough to respond to the diverse needs of her learners? Giunsa niya pag-recognize ang nagkalain-lain nga strengths and limitations sa estudyante? So maybe 5 seconds or 10 seconds for our viewers to have a look at the situation again and think about Aliana's experience a little bit. Okay. So one thing is for sure, Aliana is one of the teachers who is striving towards inclusive education. And inclusive education has a lot of definitions. Daghan kaini siya og definitions. Pero one of the most substantial and most meaningful definitions about inclusive education is taken from UNESCO in 2009. And I'd like to read it word for word para atog yung masabtan unsa ni inclusive education. On the screen, it says it is a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of needs of all children, youth, and adults through increasing participation in learning, cultures, and communities, and reducing and eliminating exclusion within and from education. Sa atong mga viewers, I'd like to invite you to have a look at the definition and pick some of the striking words or phrases nga inyong makita sa definition. Unsa man ang words or phrases nga you think are very striking from that definition. For me, one word is process, which means that we can't do it over time. It's a step-by-step process. It will take years or centuries or decades for inclusive education to happen. And one phrase that I'd like to point out is the phrase all children, youth, and adults. What this means is that kung magsulti tag inclusive education, we are not only talking about children with disabilities. A lot of times, when we talk about inclusive education, ato dayon siyang i-associate with children with disabilities. Pero in theory and in principle, inclusive education talks about all children, all learners, all students, regardless kung unsa ilang age, unsa ilang language, unsa ilang ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, or ability or disability. And then one phrase nga very interesting sa definition is reducing and eliminating exclusion. So in order for inclusive education to happen, we need to make our inclusive or our education system inclusive. You know, we need to break down barriers. For example, if imong community where you teach as a teacher, children speak different languages, for instance, you know? So as a teacher, unsaon man nimo pag-ensure na when these children come into your classroom, they understand one language and they learn the lessons through their native languages. So that's inclusive education. It's a process. It looks at all children and learners, and it's about breaking down barriers in terms of accessing education. Here, you will see unsa gining inclusive education. Inclusive education is not segregation. And I think importante nga masabtan sa atong mga viewers that inclusive education is not segregation. If you look at the screen, you'll see a picture of dots. Ang gray dots, they're actually grouped together. And then the color dots, you have purple, yellow, blue, pink, orange, green, or whatever, are also grouped together, but separately from the gray dots. Segregation is actually an approach to education where we group students according to their specific qualities. In the context of children with disabilities, oh, dili man kakakita dong, o adto na lang ka tipon sa dili pod makakita. Or if a child is not able to walk or using a wheelchair, o ilahi nato ni siya kay lahi ni siya sa ubang bata. So segregation is not inclusive education. And I think that's important for us to understand that. Inclusive education is also not integration. Integration is a process wherein atong itipon ang tanang bata regardless of their backgrounds in one classroom, but then walay support and accommodations. So for example, moingon ta, uy, atong ipa-appeal ni si Junjun na blind sa regular classroom, yet walay support si Junjun, walay braille machines, so Junjun can further his learning. Dili trained ang teacher to accommodate Junjun's needs. So inclusive education is not integration, where itipo nato tanang estudyante without support and accommodations. However, this is very important. This is what inclusive education is all about. And on the screen, you'll see how the gray and colored dots are interacting with one another, no? So they're in the same space, they're in the same classroom, interacting and learning from one another. And the twist here is there is support and accommodations. Because the principle here is you cannot just mix students of different abilities and with diverse needs without support and accommodations. This is why inclusive education is different from integration. As I said, integration is purely mixing students together without support. But inclusive education is all about supporting and accommodating every student based on his or her needs. The why of inclusive education. So, what is inclusive education? Atong tukion sa pagkakaroon, nganong importante man ang inclusive education? Why is inclusive education more powerful and more important than segregation and integration? And akong buhaton karon is to present to you arguments for inclusive education based on data and evidence globally, but also in the Philippines. One reason anong importante ang inclusive education is political. Globally, we have the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, of which the Philippines is a signatory. And in that convention, it promotes inclusive education. That means persons with disabilities should be included in mainstream education systems. There's also the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, by the United Nations, of which the Philippines signed for and committed to fulfill the stipulations of the SDGs. And also in the Philippine context, we have K-12 basic education curriculum that strongly advocates for inclusive education. That means children with and without disability should learn together in mainstream classrooms. So there are lots of policies already across the globe and in the Philippines supporting inclusive education. So that's the political argument. What about the academic side? A lot of people would say, if we include a blind child in a regular classroom, basin ma-delay ang learning pace and progress sa teacher. Unfortunately, that's not what the research shows. In fact, from an academic point of view, inclusive education allows children with and without disabilities to learn together, and it shows that when they learn together, they perform well academically. For instance, there's a research done in one of the countries in Africa where they observe how children with and without disabilities learn together in the regular classroom. And they found out that children with disabilities in inclusive classrooms actually have improved learning outcomes as compared to them being in a segregated setting. So there's an academic argument for inclusive education. There is also a social argument for inclusive education. If we contextualize the argument in Negros Oriental, wala may city or municipality nga ang gapuyo tanan puro 50-year-olds, right? Wala may barangay siguro sa Negros Oriental where all people who live there are blind or deaf or wheelchair users. Wala may sitio siguro sa Negros Oriental where all people who live there are under 20 years old. What it means here is that inclusive education reflects the reality of the society. And as they say, school should be a reflection of the society. Therefore, inclusive education should start in schools. And when you bring children together, regardless of their backgrounds, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexual orientation or disability or ability, it benefits all children. We create a more inclusive society, and that's the social argument for inclusive education. There's also the economic argument where if an education system develops two separate education systems for different groups of children, it's more expensive rather than putting these children together in mainstream schools and then invest on that setup. So if the government prefers a more cost-efficient way sa education system, inclusive education is the way to go. And then finally, in terms of the why of inclusive education, this is very important for us to understand that based on data and evidence globally and also in the Philippines, children with disabilities, and I'm focusing here on children with disabilities specifically, na they're already in mainstream schools. A lot of them are already in regular schools and in mainstream schools. If that is the case, the question is, should we send them to segregated settings or should we support them and prepare the learning environment where they're in right now? And that's the regular elementary schools or regular secondary schools. So those are some of the arguments why inclusive education is important. Now let's go to the last part. How does inclusive education look like? We've looked at the what of inclusive education. We've looked at why there is a need for inclusive education. And now let's go to how does inclusive education look like, especially at systems and schools levels. I'm bringing the systems levels because I also believe that a lot of our viewers today are also policymakers, are also curriculum developers, who work directly with the Department of Education to develop and implement policies for inclusive education. So that's why I'm interested to also look into the systems level. At the systems level, inclusive education focuses on these areas. So natay gitawag na supply, where there is a need to train the teachers, there is a need to improve the infrastructure. For example, if an elementary school sa Negros Oriental walay ramp, we need to improve that by putting in ramps so that children who use wheelchairs can access the school. So there should be an infrastructure development and improvement. There's also the learning materials in terms of braille machines, in terms of hearing aids. How do we support children with disabilities in their learning? There's also the need to look at the demand, no, in terms of attitude sa atong community. Importante nga the community is educated about disability rights because until now, stigma and discrimination against persons with disability is prevalent, which means na a lot of people still look at disability from a very negative point of view. Then we also need to look at the cost, risk and rewards. And of course, as I mentioned, curriculum with K-12, very promising kaayo atong K-12 karon because it's very flexible. It looks at the diverse needs of the learners. There's also the importance of looking at student assessment. How flexible are examinations to the diverse needs of our children? And of course, learning support. Finally, it's important to look at the policies, There's also the importance of looking at data. Kaning data importante kaayo, no? In terms of pila man kabuok children with disabilities are enrolled in our schools. Pila man kabuok children or girls, for instance, are enrolled in our schools. What about boys and all of those data? It's also important to look at financing because we can never implement inclusive education if we don't have enough funds. So these are some of the aspects that we need to look into kung moingon tag inclusive education at systems level. Now, finally, at the classrooms level, very important, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers today are teachers, head teachers, or principals, and they're working at schools or classrooms level. How does inclusive education look like at classrooms level? Naatay gitawag nga differentiated instruction, and I know a lot of teachers know about this concept. It is a philosophy or it is a process wherein we provide students with varied and different avenues of learning. And this is very synonymous to universal design for learning or UDL, and of course, multiple intelligences. Dili na lang ko mo go further into what differentiated instruction is all about, but one thing that we need to understand about this philosophy or strategy is that it aims to address the different needs of students in the classroom setting. So if you have visual students, how do you ensure that you do a lot of visual activities for them to engage in? If you have kinesthetic students, how do you ensure they engage in the activities in the classroom so they learn? So different strategies to look at the diverse needs of the students. When you look at differentiated instruction, ang atong i-consider ani is all about content, giunsa nato pag-modify ang atong content or lesson para responsive siya sa diverse needs of the students. What about the setting, the physical environment of our classroom? How do we ensure that the physical environment is accessible to everyone, regardless if they're using a wheelchair or not? What about the materials that we're using? Accessible ba siya sa tanang estudyante? What about the affective side? And finally, the instruction. How are we delivering our lessons to our students so that they're responsive to the needs of all learners and students? So here are some of the examples of how differentiated instruction looks like in the classroom. And then I'd like to invite our viewers to have a read at some of these scenarios. And the first one is the materials differentiation. And I'm bringing again the example of Aliana earlier. And this is an example of how Aliana as a teacher modifies and differentiates the materials sa iyang classroom or sa iyang lesson so that all students will be able to respond and participate in the learning process. I don't want to go through that situation anymore because we dealt with that earlier, but have a look at how Aliana as a teacher modifies and differentiates the materials so that ang iyang lessons are responsive to the needs of all students. Here's another example of how George as the teacher differentiates or makes his class inclusive from a setting point of view. And I'd like to read the scenario to all of you. George teaches in a class of 27 students. One of them uses a wheelchair. George provides the student with an adapted desk that allows him to write and to do tasks in class more comfortably. George also ensures that the classroom has enough space for the student to move around freely. So have a look again at the scenario. Unsa may na-notice ninyo sa situation ni George as a teacher? Giunsa man niya pag-modify ang physical environment sa classroom para responsive siya sa needs sa iyang mga estudyante, especially those who are wheelchair users. One thing is for sure, George is ensuring that the classroom is inclusive of all in terms of the physical environment. And finally, here is an example on how teachers can modify or differentiate instructions or lessons sa classroom using differentiated instruction para mahimong inclusive for all. And this differentiation is focused on instruction. And I'd like to read this situation. Diane teaches children with intellectual disabilities in a regular primary classroom. She handles mathematics. Right after introducing numeracy lessons to her students, Diane brings her students to grocery shops where they practice some of the numeracy skills they learn. Aside from that, Diane makes an attempt to bring exercises in the classroom to teach her students, especially those with intellectual disabilities, including how to do activities for daily living such as toothbrushing and dressing. You would notice that in this particular situation, especially sa atong mga magtutudlo, na si Diane as a teacher is not only focusing too much on academics. How she delivers her lessons to include those with disabilities and intellectual disabilities are very inclusive in a way that she delivers her lessons more practically. So aside from teaching the students how to count numeracy, she's actually teaching the students how to practice it more practically. And she's also teaching her students life skills. So bringing her to the grocery store to buy something and learn numeracy, but also teaching them about life skills, toothbrushing, dressing. So dili lang all about counting, reading, writing, and all of those, but it's also about life skills so that all children can participate. So as a recap to our discussion today, I would have loved to have the entire day to discuss about inclusive education. But since we have very limited time today, ato lang i-recap ang unsay gituki nato in the last few minutes. Of course, we discussed what inclusive education is all about. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a process. It can't be done overnight. Inclusive education also addresses all children, not only children with disabilities. It looks into girls, it looks into children with different sexual preferences or gender. So it's all about all children. And then we also discussed why inclusive education is important. We said that there is an economic argument to it. Now, inclusive education is cheaper and more cost effective than segregated or special schools or special education centers. We also said that inclusive education provides more academic improvements for all students, including those with disabilities. And finally, we talked about how inclusive education looks like from a systems level and also classroom level. We mentioned that in order to implement inclusive education, kinahanglangan atong government na funding for it. We said that there should be data and evidence of how many children are there, how many children with disabilities are there. And at the schools levels, atong gituki ang differentiated instruction, wherein teachers can modify or differentiate their contents, their materials, their physical environment, so that they are inclusive for all children. I would like to leave all of you with this powerful quote from a regular teacher in Negros Occidental. And I got this quote a few years ago when we did the Inclusion Caravan workshops. And this teacher said, "Willing man ko mutudlo og bata nga may disabilidad, basta naa lang gyud ko'y suporta og training. Lisod kaayo to feel lonely in the process. Wala ko kabulo if I'm doing the right thing for the child or not. Naaba ko'y kaduulan, for example, if naa ko'y pangutana kabayin sa akong pagtudlo sa batang may disabilidad." And this is a powerful quote or statement, primarily because teachers, ang atong mga magtutudlo, are the frontliners for inclusive education. And as I mentioned a while ago, if we provide support and accommodations to all our teachers, especially our regular teachers, in terms of training, in terms of resources, we will be able to promote inclusive education. Daghang salamat sa pagpaminaw. In Kiswahili, which is the national language of Kenya, we say asanteni sana, which means thank you, everyone.
All right, so thank you so much, Kuya Jun, for that very meaningful and very enlightening talk on inclusive education. And of course, sa atong mga viewers karon, of course, the challenge is greater now that we are transitioning into distance learning, of course, amidst the ongoing pandemic. So, indot sa kayo to, the message there was very clear for everyone. how do you make your instruction and your classes more inclusive, especially with the current setup that we are facing right now in the entire world. So thank you so much, Kuya June, for that very informative and very insightful talk on inclusive education.
Salamat, Hans, for having me. I'm so honored.
Right, so before we end with today's episode, Kuya June, what would you like to say, parting words na nimo sa tanang viewers na today, to all our viewers, not just in Negros Oriental, but also all throughout the country?
I would just like to say, Hans, nga kaning mugna sa DepEd Negros Oriental is such a best practice in terms of knowledge management and in terms of sharing of best practices. So I highly recommend and laud the DepEd Negros Oriental for this. And this is a best practice for other offices and divisions across the country nga naatay platform to share our experiences and to learn from one another. You said nga remote learning is challenging now, but this is also an opportunity to connect further. So I appreciate and I recommend DepEd Negros Oriental for this amazing initiative. And I hope the other divisions across the country can also look into this moving forward. Salamat.
All right. Once again, thank you so much. That was Mr. Rolando Jr., all the way from Nairobi, Kenya. All right, so sa tanang viewers na to, this is, unfortunately, we're at the end of another insightful and meaningful episode. Once again, my name is Hans Villarhermosa, and this has been FlexiEd, Flexible Learning Experience in Education. Whoever you are, wherever you are, and whatever you have, the quest for basic education continues. God bless, stay safe, and keep learning.